March 11, 1945, Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu. The intelligence officer's hand shook as he flipped through the blurry submarine photos, shots from Submarine 47 that he knew would haunt Naval Command for the rest of the war. There it was, a concrete ship, no guns in sight, loaded with heavy refrigeration gear and small boats ferrying supplies back and forth. They had no idea what to call it. Just unknown logistics vessel. The photos, snapped through some grainy periscope near Ulithi Atoll, showed something that didn't fit anything the Japanese Navy believed about American priorities. Meanwhile, back at the airfield, pilots squeezed pine root oil into fuel tanks, a desperate program with 34,000 distillers working around the clock, all for just 3,000 barrels of fuel. Mechanics siphoned industrial alcohol out of old gear just to keep planes running. And then out there, the Americans had a ship, apparently devoted to nothing but refrigeration. 24 Yokosuka P-1Y1 France's bombers sat on the tarmac waiting for Operation Tan No. 2. Most of those pilots barely had 50 hours in the air. Their job? Ram their planes, loaded with explosives, straight into the American fleet at Ulithi. None of them knew they were up against an enemy who'd built $1 million floating factory that churned out 500 gallons of ice cream per shift, 5 tons of dessert every single day. While Japanese airmen scraped pine bark for fuel, the Americans were eating frozen treats. The first whispers about this came after the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, when the carrier Zuikaku went down on the 25th. American destroyers pulled Japanese sailors out of the oil-slicked water. The Wakatsuki and Kuwa saved 862 officers and men. 842 others didn't make it. The survivors braced for execution, but instead got medical care and something they'd never seen before, frozen cream in metal cups. One prisoner told his Allied interrogators, "The American sailor brought me what he called ice cream. I'd heard of it, but never tasted it." There, after the greatest naval battle in history, Americans handed out frozen desserts to men who'd tried to kill them minutes earlier. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, creator of the kamikaze force, buried these stories. His pilots had to believe the Americans were soft, couldn't handle hardship. That was the only way Japanese spirit could stand a chance against American industry. The truth would wreck what was left of morale. The first solid Japanese report came from submarine reconnaissance. In December 1944, submarine I-47 under Commander Zenji Orita surfaced for a periscope look off Ulithi before launching its human torpedoes. Orita's log survives in the Naval Archives. 0630 hours, large concrete vessel observed approx 80 meters, no armament, heavy refrigeration equipment on deck, multiple small craft transferring cargo. What he'd spotted was the U.S. Navy's BRL, barge, refrigerated, large, rebuilt from an Army concrete barge for $1 million, about $17 million in today's money. This thing pumped out 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, storing 2,000 gallons at 15 degrees C, running 24/7. That's 500 gallons per shift, 5 tons a day. By January 1945, Japan's situation was beyond desperate. The battleship Yamato couldn't even leave anchor for training just to save oil. The pine root oil program had 34,000 distillers and 400,000 workers, including kids, pulling 3,000 barrels of fuel from 70,000 barrels of pine oil. The U.S. Navy burned through more than that in a single day. The 343rd Naval Air Group, Japan's last elite fighter squadron led by Captain Minoru Genda, was falling apart from hunger. Genda, mastermind of Pearl Harbor, took over in January and was supposed to clear the skies for kamikaze attacks. There aren't exact numbers, but pilots complained of night blindness, slow reflexes, and blacking out during combat. Gender wrote in his reports, "My pilots' eyes fail them at night. Malnutrition stole their vision. They shake during maneuvers from weakness. Yet they face an enemy who grows stronger every day." You saw the sharpest contrast in the kamikaze units. Most were teenagers with barely any flight time. Their final meal, rice balls, dried fish, and a sip of sake. They wore senbari, thousand-stitch belts sewn by women for protection, and then they climbed into their planes, headed for one last flight against an enemy who handed out ice cream to their own and to captured men too. Everyone knew that no amount of cloth could protect you from anti-aircraft fire. Still, at Kanoya Air Base, on March 11th, 1945, kamikaze pilots wrote their death poems before climbing into their planes. One of those poems is still on display at the Kanoya Air Base Museum. Like cherry blossoms in the spring, let us fall pure and radiant. They took off toward Ulithi, hoping to crash into ships there. That night at 8:07, one France's bomber actually made it through and slammed into the stern of the USS Randolph, killing 25 sailors and wounding 105. The carrier was back in action 3 weeks later after crews patched it up with 29 tons of steel, including I-beams yanked from a Japanese sugar mill on Saipan. While they worked, the Randolph's crew put away about 3,000 gallons of ice cream from the base. Ulithi wasn't just another dot on a map. It was a tiny coral atoll, so small it often didn't even show up on charts. By 1945, it had become the biggest naval base on Earth. When the kamikaze attacks hit in March, 722 ships packed its lagoon. That's more than the Japanese Navy ever had at its peak. This was where the invasion of Okinawa would launch. The Americans built things at Ulithi that the Japanese couldn't wrap their heads around: floating dry docks with full machine shops, a fleet post office moving 20 tons of mail daily, movie theaters showing the latest Hollywood flicks, baseball diamonds on Mogmog Island. There was a bakery ship turning out fresh bread nonstop, the USS Abatan, distilling seawater and baking pies, and an ice cream barge churning out 5 tons a day. That barge became legendary. Crews from destroyers, ships without their own ice cream gear, sent boats over with empty containers and came back loaded with vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. Everyone got served, from admirals to the lowest seamen. It was democracy delivered through dairy. Japanese intelligence just couldn't make sense of it. Captain Tamichi Harahara, probably Japan's best destroyer commander, survived every big battle from Pearl Harbor to the end. He later wrote about hearing rumors of American comfort supplies. Hara had commanded the Amatsukaze and the Shigure and fought in 14 major engagements. "At first, we thought the intelligence was wrong," he wrote in his memoir, Japanese Destroyer Captain. "Ships dedicated to ice cream while we scraped for fuel. It was impossible to believe any navy would choose such luxury in total war." Japanese code breakers pored over American supply lists. Convinced they were in code, ice cream mix had to mean ammunition. Chocolate syrup was fuel oil. Strawberry topping must be medical supplies. No one believed a fighting fleet would actually ship dessert ingredients into a war zone. And yet the evidence just kept piling up. Prisoners said there was ice cream on every ship bigger than a destroyer. Recon flights spotted refrigerated ships at every American base. Supply manifests showed more morale supplies than the Japanese gave their entire fleets in food. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, who would later sink the USS Indianapolis, saw all this up close while watching American bases through his periscope. He couldn't believe it. In his memoir, Sunk, he wrote, "The Americans operated floating cities of abundance. While we counted our last torpedoes and rationed fuel by the liter, they kept up peacetime routines in wartime. That was a strength we never imagined, being comfortable during apocalypse. His executive officer saw the same thing. We watched sailors lining up at what looked like refreshment stands. Ships weren't transferring fuel or ammo, just white containers we later learned were full of ice cream. They fought a different war than we did. Japanese pilots shot down and rescued by Americans came back with stories that didn't fit anything they'd been told. During Operation Kikusui, the 10 massive kamikaze waves thrown at Okinawa, captured pilots offered surprising details. One, whose engine failed before his suicide run, described what he saw after capture. The destroyer kept up normal operations during our attack. No panic. The crew stayed at their stations, except for the gunners. Sailors in white uniforms kept serving food. The ship's routine just continued. This wasn't the desperate enemy we expected. What these pilots saw, even if they didn't fully get it, was American confidence in their anti-aircraft guns. They could keep daily routines going, even during attacks. While kamikazes came in on their final missions, American sailors were still serving ice cream on deck. By 1945, the Americans were making so much ice cream in the Pacific that it outpaced the entire Japanese food program. At Ulithi, the Navy's floating ice cream barge could churn out 500 gallons, serving up 10 gallons every 7 minutes. The Army had 3 ice cream barges, too, together, making 1,500 gallons. Ships made their own. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, all had machines on board. Bases on land ran multiple ice cream plants at once. In 1943 alone, the Army Quartermaster Corps shipped out 135 million pounds of dehydrated ice cream mix. Every year, the U.S. military made about 80 million gallons for its troops. Now flip to the Japanese side. Their luxury was pine root oil, 3,000 barrels total, squeezed out of 34,000 tiny distillation units. By 1945, Japan's aviation fuel reserves dropped below 1.5 million barrels. Calories for civilians nosedived too. Before the war, people ate about 2,000 calories a day, but by summer 1945, it was down to 1,180. In Tokyo, after the war, rations hit rock bottom, just 755 calories a day, and that lasted for 6 months in 1946. Japanese pilot trainees got only 40 to 50 hours of fuel for practice because there just wasn't any more to go around. To put it in perspective, the Japanese military's daily rice ration for all home island forces weighed less than the ice cream American troops ate in the Pacific each day. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who personally signed off on that first Navy ice cream barge, understood something the Japanese command didn't. Morale didn't come just from slogans or sacrifice. In a classified memo, Nimitz wrote, "The Japanese expect our men to endure their conditions and break. We will demonstrate that American industrial might extends to crew comfort. A sailor who knows his country can provide ice cream in combat fights with different confidence than one expecting only hardship." This wasn't just talk, it shaped the whole Pacific Fleet. Then there's the story of the USS Lexington at the Coral Sea. On May 8, 1942, as the ship was going down, sailors broke into the ice cream stores. They scooped it into their helmets before climbing into life rafts. It became legend. The idea that comfort mattered that much just didn't compute for a Japanese military culture built on suffering as a virtue. Japanese officers who learned what Americans were really up to faced an impossible problem. How do you keep your men fighting when the truth, the scale of American comfort, could destroy morale? How do you explain that your sailors are scraping by on 315 grams of rice, while a single American barge dishes out 5 tons of ice cream? Rear Admiral Matomi Ugaki, who led battleship operations and would go on to command the last kamikaze mission, wrote in his diary after hearing intelligence reports about American comfort, "If these reports are true, we have misunderstood this war entirely. Spirit isn't enough against an enemy who brings luxury to battle." The news was so sensitive, it was classified above top secret. Officers who learned about it swore themselves to silence, but rumors have a way of slipping through anyway. Japanese radar crews sometimes spotted B-29s circling high overhead doing nothing in particular. After the war, it came out, American crews were making ice cream. They'd mix powdered milk, sugar, and cocoa in ammo cans, then let the 50-degree air at 30,000 feet freeze it while the turbulence churned it up. That's confidence, making dessert over enemy territory while Japanese pilots flew with pine root oil in their tanks, while Japanese mechanics drained hydraulic fluid to burn as emergency fuel. American air crews improvised ice cream makers at bombing altitude. During Operation Kikusui, the Japanese threw everything they had, 10 massive kamikaze waves, at the American fleet off Okinawa between April and June 1945, and they lost 1,165 planes and 4,000 pilots. Their planes were out of date, running on fuel watered down with alcohol, losing 30% of their power. For a final meal, pilots got a rice ball and water, sometimes the first real food they'd seen in days. After the massive April 6th attack, 355 kamikaze planes, 6 ships sunk, 22 damaged. American fleet reports noted morale remains high. Ice cream consumption increased 40% post-action. The psychological boost of ice cream after combat was real. It meant normalcy, comfort, a taste of home. Japanese sailors captured at Okinawa, over 11,000 surrendered, told stories that shattered old assumptions. One destroyer officer, pulled from the water after his ship sank, described it through an interpreter. "I expected torture, and maybe execution, the way we treated American prisoners. Instead, a young American sailor, younger than my youngest brother, brought me vanilla ice cream in a metal cup. He seemed embarrassed they'd run out of chocolate. I cried, not from gratitude, but from realizing we'd already lost. A nation that provides ice cream to its enemies had already won." During the war, officers buried these stories, but occupation records captured the truth. The gap between the two sides was wider than Japanese command ever guessed. When the Americans landed in August 1945, they handed out ice cream to Japanese children, many of them tasting it for the first time in their lives. The psychological shock hit hard. Everything the military government drilled into the Japanese people about American brutality and weakness just crumbled, undone by something as simple as a bowl of ice cream. In 1946, Japan's top surviving fighter ace, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, 64 confirmed kills, tasted ice cream for the first time at a U.S. airbase. Later, he wrote in his memoir, Samurai, "I understood finally why we lost. We fought, believing suffering made us strong. They fought with the confidence of abundance. We thought comfort was weakness. They saw comfort as a right their industry could guarantee anywhere." That's really the story. 2 different wars, 2 realities. The numbers say it all. American production in 1945 was on another planet. The Navy had an ice cream barge making 500 gallons a day, 10 gallons every 7 minutes. The Army ran 3 more barges, together pushing out 1,500 gallons a day. All told, U.S. military folks ate 80 million gallons a year. Dehydrated ice cream mix. In 1943, they shipped over 1 million gallons worth around the world. Every ship larger than a destroyer had ice cream machines on board. A single barge cost $1 million back then, about $17 million today. Now look at Japan in 1945. Sailors sometimes got just 315 grams of rice for their daily ration, when it was available at all. The country tried to squeeze 3,000 barrels of pine root oil out of 70,000 barrels of pine oil, with 400,000 workers mobilized. Just for that, they had 34,000 distillation units running nationwide. Pilot training dropped from more than 500 hours before the war to just 40 or 50. Fuel got so bad, they mixed in 30% alcohol, which wrecked engine performance. For a military culture built on Bushido, the way of the warrior, the idea that suffering purifies you spiritually, those American ice cream ships just made no sense. Americans didn't see comfort as weakness, but as a force multiplier. Abundance wasn't decadence, it was an advantage. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack, survived the war and later converted to Christianity, became a pacifist. When someone asked what changed him, he said, "I learned Americans fed ice cream to their enemies, not just food, luxury food. This was not the barbaric enemy we were told about. This was a civilization so confident in victory they could afford kindness and comfort during war. Those ice cream ships broke every rule the Japanese military thought was sacred, and even 4 decades later, at a 1985 US-Japan veteran reunion in Hawaii, the gap was still there. Japanese vets asked former CB Robert Mitchell, who'd worked on the Ulithi base, about the ice cream barge. They couldn't wrap their heads around it. Mitchell just shrugged. "We figured boys fighting needed ice cream. Didn't seem special at the time. It was just what you did. Take care of the troops. If we could build it, why wouldn't we?" That casual attitude, ice cream in wartime, so normal it wasn't even a big deal, says more about the difference between the two navies than any stack of battle reports. Tadamasa Itatsu, who'd trained kamikaze pilots and attended that reunion, put it this way: "We trained boys to die with empty stomachs. You trained boys to live with full stomachs and dessert. This difference explains everything about the war." Dr. John Dower, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning Embracing Defeat, wrote the ice cream barge at Ulithi was worth more than a fleet of battleships as a show of American power. "We can afford this. We have already won. We're just waiting for you to see it." Military historian Richard Frank summed it up. Japanese forces fought expecting to die gloriously. Americans fought expecting to live comfortably. This wasn't just a different strategy. It was a different civilization's approach to war. Today, if you visit the Kanoya Air Base Museum in Kagoshima, where kamikaze pilots once took off, you'll spot a tiny, easy-to-miss placard about the American ice cream ships. Added in the 90s, it helps visitors understand the impossible gulf those pilots faced. The museum shows a kamikaze pilot's last meal, a small rice ball, some pickled veggies, a cup of sake next to a photo of the American ice cream barge. No need for explanation. The picture says everything about the Pacific War. Museum curator Takeshi Yamada explained, "We added this display because visitors, especially young people, couldn't understand how we lost so completely. When they see that America built ships just for ice cream while we scraped pine trees for fuel, they finally get it. It wasn't just military defeat. It was scarcity colliding with abundance." The story of Japanese commanders discovering American ice cream ships cuts to the heart of what power means in modern war. Japan believed the power came from spirit and the capacity to endure suffering. America showed that real power comes from eliminating suffering, from creating abundance, from keeping things normal, even in the worst situations. The kamikaze pilots, no one can question their courage. They flew headlong into an enemy fighting a completely different war. Japan, desperate for fuel, dug up pine roots and squeezed out what little they could, 3,000 barrels from 34,000 makeshift distillers. Meanwhile, the Americans, they launched million-dollar ice cream barges, Japanese pilots sat down to write death poems before their last 50-hour training flights. American sailors argued over vanilla or chocolate. For Japan, victory was something spiritual. For America, it was measured in sheer output, industrial, relentless, even a little absurd. 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes. The war didn't end because Japan ran out of men willing to die. They never did. It ended the moment Japan's leaders realized what they were really up against, not just military strength, but a society so powerful it could spare entire ships just for dessert. A country so confident in victory, it treated comfort as a necessity, so rich it could waste resources on luxury, even as the world burned. The numbers make it obvious. At Ulithi, 722 American ships anchored, more than the entire Japanese Navy at its peak. One American ice cream barge churned out 500 gallons a shift. Japan scraped together 3,000 barrels of pine root fuel in total. American bomber crews made ice cream at 30,000 feet. Japanese pilots trained 40 or 50 hours on barely their fuel. American sailors griped about their ice cream flavors. Japanese sailors, if they were lucky, got 315 grams of rice. When Japanese commanders found out America had ships just for making ice cream, they realized something went deeper than military intelligence. They understood finally that they faced an enemy who'd already won. The Americans knew it and were so sure of themselves, they literally brought dessert to the apocalypse. The ice cream ships showed what the atomic bombs only hammered home. Japan was still fighting a war of scarcity. America fought a war of abundance. The result was set from the start, even if it didn't make sense to those who thought suffering was strength. In the end, true power meant never having to suffer at all. That $1 million ice cream barge at Ulithi quietly pumping out 10 gallons every 7 minutes while Japanese pilots readied themselves for death was more than a ship. It was proof their civilization had already won, long before the fighting stopped. For Japanese commanders living on pine root fuel and sacrifice, the ice cream barges weren't just strange, they were a sign that Japan had misunderstood the whole war. They brought spirit to a battle of machines. They brought suffering to a fight against comfort. The loss was already baked in.